This is Cameron Mackay for Mining Weekly, speaking to Lia Bolz, Director at Malan Scholes Attorneys, who was speaking on illegal mining and the implementation of the MPRDA, as well as the impacts that illegal mining has on communities and the South African economy. How important would you say is government intervention in terms of addressing the causes of incidents such as the recent blast in the JHB CBD and other similar events that more than likely might occur from similar, activities such as illegal mining?
Well, I think government intervention, quite honestly, is critical at this point. It's government intervention and, of course, the involvement of the SAPS. We have the laws that are there to be enforced, but we simply don't see any active steps being taken by the DMR in particular. But also, there isn't a commitment from the SAPS to take active steps. I think everything at this point is very reactionary. We're not seeing anything being done in a positive way to deal in particular with the syndicates that are clearly behind the illegal mining. And I think something else that we're seeing is we're not just dealing with zamas around Johannesburg. There are large-scale illegal mining operations happening throughout Mpumalanga, Limpopo, even in the Northwest. And it's ultimately left to landowners and often mining companies who have illegal operations within their mining areas having to take the active steps to increase security, approaching a court to get interdicts, for example. And although requests are made to the DMR to do inspections, to issue directives, there's obviously actively engaging with the SAPS to come and attend at site to try and deal with the illegal operations. And there really is no willingness. And it's really then left to landowners and mining companies to get court orders. And on the back of court orders, you may get some assistance. But even then, it's incredibly difficult. And you're relying then on private security to deal with those issues. So at this point, I think there is no other way of dealing with the matter. The law is there. It's just a question of enforcing it.
Is there anything else that government might need to focus on to support this legislation, especially maybe from a kind of stakeholder perspective?
Look, I think it's incredibly difficult to identify anything other than enforcement at this point. I think that, even something like a special unit and specialized training for the police to deal with the syndicates, I think that's principally how you're going to be able to address the illegal mining. I mean, we're talking about very serious criminals, the use of illegal firearms, etc., where stakeholder engagement, we're past that point. And I mean, there are steps being taken by the DMR in an attempt to deal with the regularization of small-scale mining and artisanal mining. But quite honestly, it's too easy to mine illegally in South Africa at the moment that trying to implement additional laws or proceed with any kind of stakeholder engagement, I mean, that's not going to solve the problem. So I think that we always come around again to the fact that there needs to be a willingness on the part of the DMRE and, of course, the SAPS to actively deal with the illegal mining.
What are some of the hazards, whether they be social, economic, health-wise, or other? What kind of hazards are posed by illegal mining and miners to, firstly, the communities that are obviously impacted by mines and illegal mining, and then secondly, maybe the miners themselves, and then as well as the overall industry?
So I think starting with the miners themselves, I mean, many of the illegal miners who are doing the active mining, you will find that they themselves are victims of the syndicates. Obviously, there's use of chemicals in uncontrolled environments such as cyanide and mercury. The obvious safety risks of entering old underground workings. There's the risk of subsidence, buildings collapsing, the use of explosives. I mean, those are just obvious health and safety risks that you would see. I mean, the use of illegal firearms, you're seeing prostitution as a consequence of large-scale illegal mining in certain areas. And now there's the obvious safety risk for the communities that live around these areas. And then, of course, you're looking at environmental impacts as well in unregulated illegal mining. Obviously, we see it in and around Johannesburg, where you can see these unrehabilitated areas where mining is taking place, but certainly on a larger scale, if you do go into certain parts of Limpopo and Mpumalanga, we're seeing enormous operations where there's open cast mining happening with no intention of rehabilitating those areas. That is, of course, an obvious concern. And the costs of that illegal mining needs to then be addressed by the DMRE. It becomes a government problem in dealing with that rehabilitation. And of course, we don't see that happening very often in any event. So I think that those are some of the more obvious impacts that are felt on the ground from a health, safety, and environmental perspective. And then, of course, from an economic perspective, a lot of these areas, because they're so unsafe, you're not going to see any sort of economic development in those areas in comparison to what you would see where you do have an established mining operation, where you would see the clear economic benefits flowing into communities who reside around those mining operations. And then, of course, no payment of royalties, no payment of taxes. That's an obvious economic consequence of whether it's small scale or large scale illegal mining. And then I think for the mining industry generally, I think that the impact on larger scale mining operations where they're well established, you have illegal miners entering into their areas and conducting illegal mining, it increases the cost of security significantly. And then, of course, in dealing with removing those illegal miners from existing mining areas, there's a significant cost involved in whether it's attending courts and having lawyers on brief, and then, of course, enforcing court orders after the fact where you don't have the support of the SAPS and you need to use private security to assist you.
How crucial would you say enacting the MPRDA be in terms of combating illegal mining and then obviously especially regulating the transfer of mining rights?
So I think that the principal issue that we're facing is the law is there. I think the only thing we could potentially see, which may be of assistance, is an increase in the penalties that you currently see in the MPRDA. The penalties range between 200,000 Rand and 500,000 Rand in fines, and then obviously terms of imprisonment. But that's very low relative to some of the other environmental legislation, for example, where you're looking at fines upwards of 10 million Rand for specific offences. So I think that would be a useful amendment we could see to the MPRDA. But again, it's a question of enforcement. We don't need to see the laws changing. We just simply need to see them enforced. And I again, to mention the artisanal mining policy, seems to be an attempt by the DMRE to regularize this industry. But because it is simply too easy to mine illegally, why would anyone feel the need to go and apply for a permit, which introduces obligations to pay taxes and to pay royalties, to limit mining to the surface, for example? Why would you do that if it's simply too easy to conduct illegal mining as you're doing? So I think that, you can leave the law aside, quite honestly, at this point. It's there and it's ready to be enforced. It's just a question of willingness on the part of the DMR.
Are there maybe any specific gaps in the current legislation that you feel, maybe needs to be addressed? So
I think that at this point in time, I mentioned the penalties could certainly increase. There is, of course, an authority given to the DMRE in the National Environmental Management Act, for example, which gives powers to certain individuals within the DMRE as environmental management inspectors. And those powers certainly do give a significant amount of authority to officials to go and do inspections, to issue directives, to proceed with raids, etc. But the problem is the level of criminality you're dealing with is you can't just enter onto a site and think, okay, well, now we're going to have a conversation. These are incredibly dangerous areas. And that's, again, why you need some sort of special unit within the SAPS that specifically targets illegal mining, even going as far as to have specialized prosecutors who are trained in prosecuting illegal miners and to expedite those prosecutions. These things just take too long to enforce. And I think that the MPRDA is there. I think a few tweaks would be of assistance, but again, it just comes down to a willingness to enforce it. And I think taking very strong active steps to put a unit in place to deal with this in an active way and not simply to be reactionary.
Is there anything that can be done in the short term, either from government side or private sector side to discourage and prevent illegal mining and the impact it has?
If I'm honest, I think that's incredibly difficult to answer, because the only people who will have the skills and the capability of dealing with this would be the SAPS, with sufficient manpower to proceed with raids in relevant places. I do think there's a general issue around failure to rehabilitate, where there are old mining shafts, etc., where access is fairly easy. They're often in areas which are actually quite highly inhabited by people, so there's easy access. There is no regulation of access control to these areas as well. So I think it's just quite easy to target them. So certainly I think if you can find mining companies who have left certain areas unrehabilitated, to potentially target them, to take some steps to rehabilitate areas. But even in that sense, I think the concern is that takes too long to do. It's incredibly difficult to find these companies, to hold them liable for those particular costs. Ultimately, if areas are unrehabilitated, that liability falls to the state to take the steps to deal with it. So whether the DMRE issues or takes active steps to proceed with rehabilitation in certain areas, unfortunately, that comes at an enormous cost. So I think that we're sitting with ultimately a problem of historic rehabilitation not being undertaken, creating easy access for illegal miners. And because I think it's so rife at the moment, you're not talking about a handful of targeted areas where you're finding zamazamas. You're finding this happening all over the place. Certainly from our perspective, we have a number of clients who do take active steps to ensure security of their mining operations, actively prevent access, but then also if there is access, they do take steps to obtain court orders to remove illegal miners from their sites. That is actively being done because the health, safety, and environmental risks for mining companies having illegal mining taking place is just not worth it for them. But I think to come back to it again, I think it's just going to be around a commitment from the DMRE to enforce the legislation, respond to cries for help from landowners and mining companies. I mean, in every court application that we bring, we cite the DMRE in asking for some level of commitment or enforcement from their side. They never oppose the application. They never participate in the application. They never arrive on site to undertake inspections. It's always left to the mining company or the landowner to deal with. And I think that just that level of engagement would assist, and just at least a willingness when there are specific issues raised to respond to them.
In terms of the MPRDA, do you see it as satisfactory, in terms of addressing, obviously illegal mining in its current form? Is it maybe just specifically in the enforcement angle that would you say that is the main problem?
Yes. I think the time it would take to try and amend the MPRDA specifically to bolster any enforcement provisions, I don't see there being much benefit in doing that. It takes too long, and ultimately you can achieve the same thing with how the law is addressed presently. I mean, the powers of the DMRE are not just derived from the provisions of the MPRDA Act. There are also provisions in the National Environmental Management Act, which give very broad enforcement powers to the DMRE. And not only the provisions of the MPRDA, but certainly the provisions of NEMA could be used by the DMRE from an environmental perspective, to certainly enforce various laws that are clearly being breached as a consequence of illegal mining. And I think any intention on the part of the DMRE to introduce and amend the MPRDA to address artisanal mining and small-scale mining, there's just simply no point. Quite honestly, it's a fantasy to think that you can try and put a plaster, so to speak, over a bullet wound by allowing these activities to be legal, where, quite honestly, illegal mining is too easy. And I think the consequences of mining from an environmental perspective, you cannot simply have a different set of rules apply to small scale or artisanal miners. It's never going to work, quite honestly. So I think at this stage, leave the MPRDA as it is. Just take active steps to enforce it.
That was Lia Bolz, Director at Malan Scholes Attorneys, speaking about illegal mining and the implementation of the MPRDA.